Across the world, a quiet revolution is unfolding. From the streets of Ouagadougou to the hearts of Africans in the diaspora, one name echoes louder with each passing day: Ibrahim Traoré. When American psychologist and Pan-African scholar Dr. Umar Johnson publicly endorsed Traoré as the most relevant African leader of our time, it was more than just praise. It was an acknowledgement that a new model of leadership is emerging from Africa, one that values sovereignty, simplicity, and people over profit. Dr. Umar's words came after a historic event. On April 30th, millions of Africans across continents rallied in support of Traoré. From Jamaica to Johannesburg, from London to New York, they marched under the same banner: "Hands off Burkina Faso." This unprecedented show of unity wasn't orchestrated by governments or media networks. It was the voice of ordinary Africans reclaiming their narrative, rejecting decades of manipulation by Western powers that claim to bring peace while leaving nations in ruin. Traoré's leadership style defies convention. He refuses luxury, rejects foreign domination, and wears the same modest clothing each day as a symbol of solidarity with his people. His decisions mirror the legacy of Thomas Sankara, whose vision of self-reliance and dignity continues to inspire a new generation. To many, Traoré represents not just a president, but a mirror of what Africa could become when it stands tall without foreign masters. Dr. Umar's endorsement carries a deeper message. Africa no longer needs approval from Paris, Washington, or London. It needs leaders who are unafraid to act, to think independently, and to speak for their people. As the Western powers scramble to maintain influence, the tide is shifting. The age of dependency is giving way to the rise of a sovereign generation. When Dr. Umar Johnson spoke about Ibrahim Traoré, he was not simply giving political commentary. He was describing a turning point in African consciousness. For decades, Africa's leadership narrative was dominated by caution, dependency, and compromise. Western governments promoted leaders who spoke softly, signed contracts quietly, and maintained the illusion of progress while resources continued to flow out of the continent. In contrast, Ibrahim Traoré has become a symbol of disruption, representing a generation that no longer asks for permission to be free. Dr. Umar reminded the world that every time NATO or the United States claims to bring peace, what follows is chaos. History has proven it from Libya to Iraq, from Haiti to the Sahel. The West does not build peace. It manufactures control. When Traoré expelled French troops from Burkina Faso and reclaimed the country's gold reserves for the people, he broke an unwritten rule of post-colonial politics. He stopped playing the game that had kept African nations trapped in economic and military dependence. The Western reaction was predictable. Media outlets began portraying him as a dictator in uniform. Officials in Paris and Washington whispered about stability risks and security concerns. Yet on the ground, the people saw something different. They saw schools reopening, farmers receiving equipment, and communities organizing their own defense. They saw dignity returning to a land once defined by foreign bases and external debts. Dr. Umar pointed out that what frightens the Western establishment is not Traoré's policies alone. It is his popularity. The massive demonstrations of April 30th showed that Pan-African solidarity is alive in the modern era. This was not a small event organized by activists. It was a worldwide response from ordinary citizens, young and old, from Kingston to Kinshasa. The message was clear. The age of manipulation through aid and propaganda is fading. Africans everywhere are connecting through shared pain and renewed pride. According to Dr. Umar, the Western fear runs deeper than politics. It is demographic. Most of Africa's population is under 30 years old. That means the continent's future will be shaped by a youthful majority that is no longer willing to accept the myth of inferiority. Young Africans have access to information, technology, and history in ways their parents never did. They know the stories of Patrice Lumumba, Amilcar Cabral, and Thomas Sankara. They understand how each was betrayed and why their dreams were buried before completion. In Ibrahim Traoré, many see a continuation of those unfinished revolutions. Dr. Umar also addressed a crucial point about Africa's global position. He reminded listeners that the alliance forming among Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger could change the geopolitical landscape. These nations, long considered peripheral, are now shaping a new axis of resistance in the Sahel. If they succeed in building strong, independent institutions, it could inspire a continent-wide liberation movement, unlike anything in modern history. The possibility of a unified African strategy terrifies those who depend on Africa's resources to sustain their own economies. This fear is not only external. Within Africa, there are still leaders and elites who profit from the old system. They prefer foreign loans to local innovation, foreign armies to domestic defense, and Western applause to African respect. Dr. Umar called them what they are: house servants of the global empire. Their loyalty to foreign interests keeps the continent divided and dependent. But Traoré's rise has exposed their weakness. His modest lifestyle, refusal of luxury, and dedication to sovereignty make corruption harder to justify. Another major theme in Dr. Umar's discussion was the war on African memory. He explained how colonial powers continue to dominate not only through economics, but through culture and education. Most African students learn more about European history than their own. They can describe the French Revolution, but know little about the liberation struggles that shaped modern Africa. This cultural disconnection weakens political awareness. It makes propaganda easier to spread. For Dr. Umar, the battle for freedom must begin in the classroom as much as on the battlefield. He argued that Africans must build a socialization system that teaches pride and self-knowledge from childhood. In China, children grow up learning that their identity is sacred. In Africa, many grow up being told that European systems are superior. This mindset must change if Africa is to stand independently. Traoré's government has started to push education reform, emphasizing history, agriculture, and civic duty. It is a small beginning, but it carries immense symbolic power. What Dr. Umar's message ultimately reveals is that the struggle for African sovereignty is both external and internal. It is a fight against global exploitation and against mental submission. Traoré's emergence is a reminder that leadership rooted in humility and courage can awaken the pride of an entire people. The West may possess greater weapons and wealth, but Africa holds something far stronger, a collective awakening that no empire can suppress forever. The endorsement of Ibrahim Traoré by Dr. Umar Johnson did more than unite Pan-African voices. It revealed a deeper shift in the balance of global power. For decades, the West has relied on a simple formula: divide African nations politically, exploit them economically, and control them psychologically. But the rise of a new generation of African leaders, led by figures like Traore, is breaking this cycle. Their message is simple, but powerful. Africa no longer accepts the role of a dependent partner. It demands respect, equality, and ownership of its destiny. The support for Traore is not just symbolic. It represents a growing awareness among Africans across continents that liberation cannot come from foreign aid or Western approval. It must come from unity and self-determination. Dr. Umar's praise of the April 30th demonstration underscored how social media has transformed activism. Where past movements were isolated by geography and censorship, digital connectivity now allows a farmer in Ghana to stand in solidarity with a student in Jamaica. This new digital unity gives strength to a cause that no military alliance can easily suppress. Western governments understand this power, which is why they respond with propaganda. They label every independent African leader as a dictator or extremist. They weaponize the media to shape global perception, using fear to justify intervention. Yet every accusation reveals their anxiety. If Traoré were insignificant, he would not be targeted. The repeated attempts to discredit him show that he represents something larger than Burkina Faso. He represents a challenge to the narrative that Africa cannot lead itself. Dr. Umar pointed out that the Western powers are not concerned about democracy in Africa. They are concerned about losing control of African resources. From gold in Burkina Faso to uranium in Niger, from oil in Nigeria to cobalt in the Congo, every African resource fuels Western industries. When Traoré and other leaders in the Sahel region nationalized their resources, it sent shockwaves through global markets. Suddenly, Africa was not begging for investment, but demanding fair trade. That shift in tone signaled the beginning of what many now call the sovereign generation. This movement has inspired intellectuals, youth activists, and even artists across the continent. Songs, documentaries, and podcasts now celebrate African unity and resistance. Universities are introducing courses that highlight modern African history rather than colonial achievements. What once seemed like isolated acts of rebellion are now part of a larger cultural awakening. The red, black, and green flag that Dr. Umar referenced is not just a symbol of pride. It is a declaration of mental and political independence. However, this awakening comes with risks. Dr. Umar warned that Western powers will not relinquish control peacefully. They have used the same tactics for decades: coups, assassinations, and debt traps. From Patrice Lumumba to Thomas Sankara, history is filled with examples of African leaders who dared to challenge the empire and paid the ultimate price. This is why the protection of leaders like Traoré is a collective responsibility. His survival is not only about Burkina Faso, but about preserving the momentum of a continental revolution. Dr. Umar also highlighted a crucial weakness within African societies: the lack of political education. Many Africans are unaware of how neo-colonial systems continue to function under modern names like development aid and foreign investment. This ignorance allows the same forces that exploited Africa for centuries to continue their influence under new disguises. For true liberation, Africa must cultivate citizens who understand the mechanisms of control and know how to resist them. In this sense, Dr. Umar's endorsement is not just a gesture of solidarity. It is a call to arms for intellectual and cultural sovereignty. He urges Africans to take control of their narratives, their schools, and their economies. He challenges parents to teach their children pride in their identity. He calls on leaders to prioritize national interest over foreign approval. These actions may seem small individually, but together they form the backbone of lasting independence. As the conversation grows, so does the fear among those who have long profited from Africa's weakness. The West cannot fight this new revolution with tanks or sanctions alone, because it is not just a political movement. It is a psychological transformation. The people no longer see themselves as victims of history, but as authors of a new one. Traoré's modest lifestyle, his rejection of foreign luxury, and his focus on equality remind Africans that leadership is not about power, but service. Dr. Umar's final words capture the essence of this transformation. He said that Africa's liberation will not be televised in Western media, but it will be lived in every act of defiance, every village that rebuilds, and every youth who learns the truth. The fight for sovereignty begins not in parliaments, but in the mind of every African who decides that freedom is no longer negotiable. The rise of Ibrahim Traoré has triggered global reactions that expose the deep fractures within international politics. To the West, his defiance is seen as a threat to the existing order. To Africans and much of the global South, he represents hope, integrity, and the courage to reject submission. Dr. Umar Johnson emphasized that the growing support for Traoré across continents is more than admiration. It is a signal that the post-colonial illusion is collapsing. Nations once considered dependent are now demanding respect on their own terms. In the eyes of the United States and France, the Sahel region has long been a zone of control. Military bases, aid programs, and financial systems like the CFA franc were all tools to maintain influence. Yet with Traoré, Mali's Assimi Goïta, and Niger's Abdourahmane Chiani forming an alliance based on sovereignty and mutual defense, this system is beginning to crumble. Western officials describe these developments as instability. In reality, it is independence. What the West calls chaos is often the sound of Africa freeing itself from its handlers. Dr. Umar pointed out the hypocrisy at the heart of Western diplomacy. When the United States builds military alliances, it is called strategy. When Africa seeks unity, it is called rebellion. When France exploits African gold and uranium, it is called cooperation. When Africans reclaim their resources, it is called corruption. This double standard reveals the moral weakness of Western institutions that claim to support democracy while undermining it abroad. Russia and China, meanwhile, have approached Africa differently. Whether their motives are pure or strategic is still debated, but their engagement has given African leaders new leverage. Dr. Umar highlighted that Moscow's open support for Burkina Faso's sovereignty demonstrates a shift in global alignment. When President Putin publicly warned Western nations to keep their hands off Traoré, it sent a powerful message. The old days of unilateral Western dominance are fading. A new multipolar world is emerging, one where Africa can negotiate from a position of strength rather than dependence. This transformation is not happening without resistance. Western intelligence networks, private contractors, and media agencies have intensified efforts to destabilize independent African governments. Dr. Umar warned that the most dangerous threat to Traoré will not come from outside, but from within. History shows that foreign powers rarely attack directly when they can infiltrate. From Lumumba to Sankara, betrayal always came from insiders corrupted by foreign promises. He called it the Judas factor, a timeless strategy of empire. It is not the foreign soldier who destroys revolutions, but the local collaborator who sells them. The global demonstrations on April 30th also created a political shockwave. For the first time in decades, Africans across the diaspora acted as one body. From Harlem to Harare, they held signs demanding that Western powers stop interfering in African affairs. The message, "Hands off Burkina Faso," was not simply about one nation. It was about an entire continent, tired of manipulation, disguised as aid. This global response caught Western media off guard. They could not ignore millions of people rallying for a leader they had tried to portray as radical. Dr. Umar noted that such solidarity has the potential to reshape African identity worldwide. For too long, Africans in the diaspora have been separated by geography, language, and colonial borders. Yet this event revealed that Pan-Africanism is not a relic of the past. It is a living philosophy. When people in Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America stand up for an African president, it means the psychological walls of division are breaking down. This awakening terrifies those who benefit from African disunity. Western leaders prefer an Africa that is fragmented and dependent, where each country negotiates alone. But unity changes the equation. If African nations trade with each other, develop shared currencies, and build common defense systems, they become immune to external manipulation. This is the future that Traore and his allies envision, and it is the very outcome that Western policy has tried to prevent since independence. Dr. Umar's endorsement amplified this vision far beyond African borders. He spoke directly to the diaspora, urging them to support the continent not through pity, but through partnership. He reminded listeners that the fight for sovereignty is global, not regional. What happens in Ouagadougou affects Kingston, Harlem, and Port-au-Prince. The West knows this too, which is why it fears a unified black political identity more than any weapon. Once Africa and its diaspora recognize their shared strength, the balance of power will shift permanently. The international response to Traoré's leadership reveals a clear truth. The world is entering a new era where Africa is no longer a passive observer in global affairs. It is an active architect of its destiny. The Western narrative of saviors and victims is losing its grip. The rise of Ibrahim Traoré and the wave of support that follows him mark more than a political moment. They reflect a global awakening that challenges centuries of control. Dr. Umar Johnson's endorsement reminds both Africa and the diaspora that freedom is not simply declared. It must be defended daily. His words carry the weight of history, echoing the sacrifices of Lumumba, Cabral, and Sankara. Each of them stood for sovereignty, and each faced the wrath of the same forces that now target Traoré. Africa's struggle today is not fought with colonial armies, but with contracts, loans, and propaganda. The weapons have changed, but the purpose remains the same. The West fears an Africa that owns its future, speaks with one voice, and demands a fair share of its wealth. This fear fuels the campaigns to label African patriots as radicals. But what the West calls radical, Africans now call necessary. Dr. Umar's warning is clear. The same global system that once used soldiers now uses media, debt, and division. African nations that reject dependency will be isolated, pressured, and misrepresented. Yet unity can turn isolation into power. If the Sahel alliance between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger succeeds, it could spark a wave of cooperation across the continent, from the Horn of Africa to the Caribbean. A connected black world would be the empire's greatest threat and Africa's greatest opportunity. But there is also a moral test. Sovereignty means responsibility. If African leaders demand independence, they must also deliver justice, transparency, and progress. The people's trust is sacred, and losing it would destroy everything this new movement represents. Dr. Umar calls this era the rebirth of African leadership. It is a generation defined by courage, modesty, and vision. Traore may not be the only leader of this awakening, but he stands as its clearest symbol. His example reminds the world that the African dream is not dead. It is rising again. And this time, it is guided not by fear, but by conviction that Africa's destiny belongs to Africans alone. Africa stands at a crossroads once again. The endorsement of Ibrahim Traoré by Dr. Umar Johnson is not the end of a story, but the beginning of a movement that tests the courage of an entire generation. It is no longer about one leader or one nation. It is about a continent reclaiming its place in the world. The West sees this awakening as a threat because it knows what will happen when Africa stands united. The flow of wealth, influence, and truth will change direction, and those who once ruled through debt and division will lose control. Yet this awakening comes with danger. History teaches that when African leaders rise, the world powers react. Assassinations, sanctions, and misinformation campaigns are their favorite tools. The same playbook used against Sankara and Lumumba will be used again. But this time, Africa is not isolated. The diaspora watches, the youth mobilize, and technology connects the struggle like never before. If the old powers attempt to silence one voice, a million others will speak louder. Dr. Umar's message reminds Africans everywhere that freedom is not given by foreign hands. It is earned through unity, discipline, and sacrifice. The warning is clear. If Africa repeats the mistakes of dependency, it will lose this rare window of transformation. But if it learns from history and protects its sovereignty, it can finally shape a new world order grounded in equality and respect. The fight ahead will not be easy, but every step toward independence is a victory for generations yet unborn. Now is the time to choose. Will Africa continue to wait for permission, or will it lead with conviction? The call to action is simple. Support African sovereignty. Question the propaganda. Celebrate leaders who serve the people, not the empire. The era of silent submission is over. A new voice is rising, carried by those who refuse to kneel. Share this message, keep the conversation alive, and remember, the revolution will not be televised, but it will be built by African hands.